When we talk about women in history, we tend to prefer to talk about the women who stood out from the crowd. But I think that the women in the crowd also deserve some attention. Hello. When we talk about the caretaking of the animals of the farm, it's a bit difficult to sort out what's what. As usual, there isn't much written about how the everyday life on a farm was managed. We can find quite a bit on what the science of different era had to say about the agriculture and how it should be run. But how that translated to real life is not very easy to find, actually. Since the men's work often kept them away from home for long periods of time, or at least for the entire day, all the chores that needed to be done at home, at the farm, became the responsibility of the women. And a big part of that was taking care of the animals. How much work that actually was, of course, depended a bit on how rich or how poor you were. But as soon as they could afford it, the farmers hired at least one, preferably more than one, maids. Often they actually preferred to hire a maid instead of a male farmhand, since the maid were only paid about half of what the male farmhand was paid. And at least some of their chores would be the same. And the male farmhand also needed finished clothes as part of his payment, while the maid were only given the materials for the clothes, and then she could make them herself. If there was a maid, or more than one, the care of the animals became her or their responsibility, even if the housewife had the last say in everything the maids did. The feeding of the animals was a huge deal, and the making of the hay and other animal feeds required most of the summer's work from the men, since they needed the fertile land near the farm to grow food for humans. They couldn't let the animals graze there either. And in Scandinavia, as in most of the world, well, at least in Europe and Western Asia, people tended their animals by moving their livestock between summer and winter pastures. Well, in Scandinavia, of course, there were no pasture in the real winter, because everything was kind of covered in snow then. But that only made the haymaking even more important. Usually, they took their animals to more remote areas where the land wasn't good enough for crops. There they had a smaller farm, or perhaps just a hut, where they lived while the animals were out grazing, often on common land, actually. What animals have been most important then? Well, of course that differs a lot, since the geography of different area differs. But mostly it has been cows, sheep and goats. As usual, when we talk about something that, as the summer pasture practice, has been going on in several places, there are hundreds of different names for it, even in the same country and language. In the British Isles, for instance, there are different names for it in Scottish, Welsh, Cornish, Irish, not to talk about all the Gaelic dialects. So I'm just talking about it as summer pasture. In quite a large bit of Europe, it seems like the entire family have been moving with the animals to their summer pasture, and often the herders were boys or young men who spent their entire day with the animals. But in northern Scandinavia, the summer pasture times were all handled by women. From the beginning of the summer, one or perhaps two maids spent their entire time more or less alone with the animals. The animals were milked in the morning and then let out to pretty much walk around as they wished, grazing. And in the evening they were all called in to be milked again and stabled for the night. During the day she took care of all the milk and made all the cheese and butter that the family were supposed to eat during the rest of the year. In September they all moved back to the farm where they all lived through the winter. But since we are talking about animals, it's a bit boring to just look at me, isn't it? So, over to me. So I thought I should introduce you to some of my friends. As you can see, winter is coming here where I live. Hello. Hello, darling. Here in the northern parts of Sweden, the cows have been the most important animals. As you can see, these girls are very small. These three are from two different breeds. The breeds are very closely related, though. The two girls at the ends are Swedish mountain cattle, and the lovely lady in the middle is Swedish unique mountain cattle. They are very well adapted for the life they are cut out for. Heavily forested lands, and, as their names indicates, mountain terrain. They give much less milk per day than new modern breeds, but the milk contains more fat than regular milk, as well as a unique compound of vitamins and proteins. And that makes it the very best milk for cheese making. These two breeds are extremely rare. There are actually fewer of these than there are tigers in the world. There are around 600 of the Swedish mountain cattle and under 300 of the Swedish unique mountain cattle. Of course, all these three girls are part of the gene bank, as are all the animals. If you want to know more about these animals, I'll put a link in the description box. Well, I'll put it there even if you don't want to know more. Back to the history. In these parts of Sweden, when they were not at their summer pasture, the maids often even lived in the barns with the animal. They had to get up really early to milk and tend to them anyway. But mostly it was about keeping the animals warm during our pretty cold winters. The maids had their own fireplace in their room, and the chimney had its back to where the animals were kept. And that way, the heat from the fire also benefited the animals. There were, of course, people that couldn't afford a cow. For them, the goats were the way to survive. Everyone had goats. But for poor people, the goats made up a much bigger part of their livelihood. The goats are quite often referred to as poor man's cow. The animals that the women had the least to do with is actually these girls. These girls, they belonged to the men. Hello, darling. They were such a big part of the men's work. Everything they had to do, they had to use the horse. So the horses belonged to the men, and all the other animals belonged to the women's line of work. She's a true beauty, isn't she? Yes, you are. Yes, you are. Yes, you are. In these parts, the handling of the cows and the goats were so closely connected to the women that the men rarely was even let into the barn, and they wouldn't know what to do there anyway. There is one story of an old poor couple who had only one cow. That cow, of course, were their entire livelihood. And one day the woman got so ill that she couldn't even get out of bed. Now the man had a real problem. Not only was his wife really sick, but their cow could also get sick if she wasn't properly milked, and he had no one to ask for help. How do you think he solved it? Did he perhaps try to milk the cow himself? No, of course he didn't. He brought the cow to his wife, who had to lie there in her bed and from there milk the cow. What happens to the women's relations to the animals once the industrialization comes? Well, that's a question for another video. I hope you learned something new today. See you soon, I hope. Bye! Oh, you're really curious.